Number 42 in the 50 most relevant. That is where we find ourselves today. Jayden Short, the Richmond Tiger. He's a fascinating player. He's been a premium for us before, and a little bit of a down season in 2024 does mean there's a potential upside outcome for us this season into 2025, or the potential for some heartbreak. We are going to discuss all the potential variables and outcomes of what Jayden Short and the Tigers in general might deliver for us this upcoming fantasy football and AFL season. Joining us on this podcast, man, we introduced to you, at least through the 50 most relevant 12 months ago, but I guarantee you already knew him and the great work that the Ball Boys have been doing in the AFL fantasy landscape for probably the past 2 to 3 seasons now. Absolute stars at what they do, and it's an absolute pleasure to have Mitch Casey on the pod and rocking the cap, my friend. Congratulations.
Well, I knew this was a video podcast as well, so I had to put the hat on. I'll take any chance at any possible moment to be a bit smug. I think, a lot of hours went into this hat, so I think I've earned it.
You have more than earned it, and hopefully you can do a mini monk and go back-to-back hats, as long as you don't have, has anyone done a triple hat? Pretty sure.
I'm not sure they have. I'm not sure they have. The people who have done the double either do a Selby and retire, or just fall off.
Just get out of Dodge.
I think, let's concentrate on the second hat before we worry about the third.
All right, let's get our orders correct. I'm with you. All right. Well, let's talk about Jayden Short. He's in at number 42 this year, coming in at a seasonal average of 80.5 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, and just a margin over that in SuperCoach, sitting in at the 82. It's in that format he is at his cheapest, with a price tag of just over $440,000, while in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, there's only a handful of thousands of dollars between him. He's an $825K AFL Fantasy option and just dropped basically $10K, and that's where he sits in Dream Team. Last year, from a top score perspective, 130 was the seasonal best in SuperCoach. That is a long way off what he did in 2020, when against the Cats he gave us a 169, while over in AFL Fantasy, his top score last year came against the Crows, but just 2 years earlier than that, he dishes up a real tasty 131 against the GWS Giants all the way back in March of 2022. I think, Mitch, maybe we should probably come back right to the start. Yes, we'll look through the past few seasons and what he's done and the potential outcomes, but I always love starting the framework of these players, kind of looking at the style and the type of player that they are. Sometimes in the AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach community, we know what a player's average is and disposal efficiency and just those kind of data metrics, but we forget the style and the type of player that they are. Talk us through, as a person that, again, if you're watching this on YouTube, there might be some slight giveaway about, maybe or not, which line of sight that Mitch has on a football team. But talk to us about Jayden Short. Like, what is his strengths as a player? What does he bring from a footballing sense? Because I think these elements ultimately will unlock whether or not, from a fantasy and SuperCoach perspective, he is an outcome that we should be chasing after this year.
Yeah, he obviously, if you can't tell, I'm a Richmond fan. I have been for a little bit, and it used to be a good thing. Now it's a bit of a sad thing. But Jayden Short is, I would say, the best kick at Richmond, at least clearly now. I think with some of the departures, he's got the most damaging foot in our team. He can kick the furthest. He can probably kick the most accurately, and he's been the designated kicker, the quarterback, if you will, for Richmond in the past. And this season in particular, I would argue that it is his most important season in terms of steering the ship when it comes to the amount of inexperience that's going to be around him, because he's played in premierships, he's played in finals, and he's done so to a high degree. So he's going to be leaned on very heavily as that key ball mover in the back line for Richmond, and gets a vast majority of his points off uncontested marks. His kick to handball ratio is right up there, and so it should be, because, it is his kick that really puts him on the map of the AFL landscape.
It certainly is. For a team that was ranked bottom 2 in the league for total kicks, he somehow gets himself 9th overall in the league for kicks per game, and it was a top 20 guy for meters gained per game. So here is a guy that even with other avenues that were in the team last year that have now departed. Oh yeah, we are going to talk about that big change and turnover that's happened at Tigerland. He's still in some of the upper echelons of ball use and ball movement coming out of defensive 50 for the Tigers. If we look at it from a fantasy landscape, that seasonal average of 80, look, there's a couple of tons in there. Okay, it's more than a couple, it's 6. There's 4 additional scores, 90 plus. And when you remove an injury impacted game, which is always dangerous, but when it happens so early in a game like it did in that round 5 matchup for him, it feels a bit safer to justify that you take those injury impacted games out. He's only got 2 scores under 70. And so much didn't come his way last year. While in SuperCoach, an average of 82, 7 tons, additional 6 scores of 80 plus. Maybe slightly concerning was the 3 scores that weren't injury impacted under 55. But again, that's probably more indicative of just the challenges that Richmond faced last year. But Mitch, when we look at the past 2 seasons before this one of 2024, we're talking about a guy who's consistently getting 8 to 11 tons in SuperCoach and averages 98 and 98 basically back to back in 23 and 22. And in AFL Fantasy at 92 and 97 and 6 to 8 tons. And so he's shown us over a number of years, let alone if we go back to the premiership era, even in the past 2 to 3 seasons, he's right on the edge of a top 10 to 15 defender. And now he's got some baked in value due to a down 2024 season.
Yeah, I mean, the round 5 injury, it's one of those injuries where it happens so early in the game. Like, he scored 11 points. I think he played less than 20% time on ground. Like, it's a game that I think you can very comfortably delete from his, because you're not drafting a player expecting them to go down to the first score at any point. You're crossing your fingers not. So when you're picking a player, you want to sort of visualize, okay, if everything goes well, what do I expect them to be giving me on a week-to-week basis? And if you delete that game, he went on to average 83.8 points, and he did so in 79% time on ground last season. So you're already basically boosting another 3 points per game just on that one game alone. I mentioned the time on ground there as well, because historically he's been a player for Richmond that's played the previous 2 seasons. I think he was at 86% time on ground and 82% the previous 2 seasons. So 2021 and 2022, when his averages were above 90 plus. And with the departures that we've seen happen from Richmond, there's no way I expect Jayden Short's time on ground to not rise with the amount of inexperience coming into the team. So a player like him, if he's going to play less than 80%, I'd be shocked. So even based on that alone, if he had the same scoring points per minute that he did last season, if he went back to the 92%, the 82% that he did in one of his seasons, his scoring would effectively be 87 per game, which I think should be his absolute floor. Nothing changes, no market share changes, no scoring changes for Richmond, no game style changes. He just goes up an extra 3% time on ground. He gets to 87. If he goes to the 86% time on ground, which he did in 2021, then he goes up to a 90. Where's my notes here? He goes up to a 91. Yeah. So that is basically with no other changes happening. And I could easily see that happening just by you bringing in 6 rookies into the team. You're going to have those players on the bench more. Your senior players are going to be out on the field more, which I can easily see happening for a Jayden Short. So I don't think it takes much to see that average come up, even without any other points per minute changing for him.
Absolutely. There's a bunch of things we've got to talk about now about the Tigers that ultimately have this cascading impact on whether or not he's relevant. Look, I've got him in at 42. So clearly I think Jayden Short is among some of the most relevant options we should be considering across AFL Fantasy, Dream Team and SuperCoach. But you've not only alluded to it, you flat out just mentioned it. A quarter of Richmond's team is out the door from what was their best 22 probably 12 months ago. The most notable that people are probably looking at that could be linked to Jayden is Dan Rioli. There are others that have impacted that role. Bolton's come up through the ground, played important components. Baker's been the Mr. Fix-It for so many different reasons, and a bunch of others. But talk to me about this changing best 22, because this has impacts on roles, market share, positional allocations that are available, how they move the ball. Like, everything changes off the back of what they do to replace this quarter of the team turnover.
Yeah, you don't lose a quarter of your team and nothing changes. Like, I don't care what team you are. And it's not the fact that they've lost 6 players that were all of them premiership players, all of them, walk-up starts basically for the last 5 or 6 years. You've replaced them with no established player. You're replacing them with first-year players. You're replacing them with players who you look at maybe, okay, the first 2 draft picks in Smiley and Laylor, like, they might be coming onto the scene when it comes to fantasy scoring. But outside of those 2 players, like, a lot of the draft picks that Richmond selected were key position players. Someone like an Taj Houghton won't be there at the start of the season. So you're not going to have guys walking and scoring the same amount of points. And although they're not impressive averages, Rioli was 3rd in the team with 83. Liam Baker was 7th in the team at 79. Dusty was 10th in the team at 64. Jack Graham had the same average. He was 11th. And then Marlon Pickett, who's also gone, was 55. All in all, that's nearly 420 points with an average of 70 points per game per player leaving the team. I don't think you're going to get these 6 rookies coming into the team all averaging 70 plus. So those points have to go somewhere. Some of you might be sitting there thinking, okay, Richmond are going to be really, really bad. And I guarantee you, they are going to be bad. They were really, really bad last year, like historically bad. They were second last year in fantasy points, only to the Eagles. The Eagles and Richmond had the lowest score fantasy average since 2013 from Melbourne. And the only 2 teams to score less than 1,400 as a team in that time. So no other team had gone that low. Not North Melbourne, not previous West Coast Eagles, no other team. So there really is no way but up for a team like that. And you're also losing a lot of confident players. So that's going to cause some change in game style as well, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think that favors players in the defensive half of the ground. So the market share I've heard being used as a concern, like, can you have a player averaging 90 plus in a team that's as low scoring total as them? I don't think it's that much of an issue to me, because someone has to score points. You've got 5 of the top 10 players leaving the team. It's going to trickle into the best players, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. A couple of weeks ago on the channel, we did a chat with AFL draft guru. We had him on just a couple of days ago too, in the 50 most relevant in Dylan Alexander. He talked about this slightly problematic makeup of the Richmond midfield, where they're all very contested, very inside, and there's not a lot of polish and skill and deep penetrating kicks that hit their targets. And while Short's not a midfielder, I know he was trialled there for a period of time through Richmond. I can see a world where they change this game style up a little bit is a player like Short becomes an absolute pressure valve ball movement king for them. Because as you mentioned at the top of the podcast, he's probably their deepest kick. He's probably their most penetrating and accurate. And with a midfield mix that's heavily contested, heavily insided, a lot of big bodies, not a lot of speed yet to come through there. There will be some time over the next couple of drafts that they'll bring that in for sure. I can see a world where Jayden Short becomes the way we saw Nick Dacos was in that Collingwood era. They were very different teams, but where they were just looking for Nick for that handball receive at any given moment, because that's where their speed and their kicking was coming through. I can see a world where the Tigers, because of what you've mentioned, go, the inexperience, the lack of depth in kicking, the lack of skill that is going to come at the AFL level from kids in time. Short could be the outlet option almost always from anything coming off the defensive half.
Yeah, 100%. And that's when you look at from like a total loss point of view. Like you did mention, obviously, Dan Rioli is a big part of that. Now, a lot of the time, the past 2 years specifically, Richmond tried to use Rioli's run and carry a little bit more, and maybe went away a bit from Short's just pure kicking ability. And obviously, you've taken that option away, and we haven't really replaced it with anything. Again, like you don't have an option to go, okay, we lost Rioli, but we're going to turn to this person. To me, it's going to shift the decision making of, okay, we don't have that to use as penetration as much. Let's go back to our other weapon, which we were using a couple of seasons ago, and lean on that a bit more. Like he's not an older player. He's still younger than 30 years old, so I think he still has the capacity to do that. It really is just like a decision making on who's going to be the usage coming out of that back half or at the back of certain stoppages and things like that. So I think either which way you slice it, it can only really mean good things for a player as polished as Jayden Short.
There were only 2 teams last year that averaged under 200 kicks, and you mentioned this at the top of the podcast, that an evolving game style of Richmond and what it's going to look like. They were the second worst scoring team in AFL Fantasy, they were the worst in SuperCoach, and historically low across all those elements. I think something that gets missed about Short is he's such a metres gained player. And while he was 19th in the league last year, he only had 471 metres gained on average. The 3 seasons prior to that, his lowest was 545. And so you've talked about this changing game style. I'm curious, again, we're deep diving in on the Tigers and their ball movement before we quickly move to his fantasy outcomes for 2024 into 2025, because if they're doing what he did in 2024, don't even bother. Walk away, hit skip on the podcast, go and check out the latest Ball Boys fantasy podcast. There's more nuggets for you. Even if you don't play AFL fantasy, there'll be more nuggets for you in that than sticking around going, oh, let's pontificate around a repeat of 2024 for the Tigers, because you won't want Jaden Short.
No.
How do you see this ball movement change? Because historically, teams that are developing a lot of youth at a bulk core go very slow ball movement, try to maintain possession a lot, just to politely minimise the damage on the scoreboard a little bit. We've seen North Melbourne do it over a number of years as well. Do you see the Tigers doing a similar thing in 2025, or do you see some speed still coming off that back line?
I was very interested in this myself because my gut feel is that, yes, I do expect them to do a bit more of the North Melbourne. And in fact, I went and looked at it. We've actually already started to see it. The first 11 games, or first 13 games of the season. Actually, I'll go back further. So we're looking at uncontested marks here. So there's 2 ways you can kind of get uncontested marks. Either you're dominating a team and you've got the ability to move the ball with better accuracy. Your players are getting into space, outworking the opponents. And so good teams you see do this. Teams like St Kilda, players like a Lockie Whitfield are really good at this. He's not getting necessarily cheap ball, he's just outworking players. So when the Tigers were a bit better in 2021, they had 80.4 uncontested marks. 2022, they had 70.2. Both those seasons, Jayden Short was up in the 90-plus averages. 2023, we saw a drop down to 73.6, and last year it was at 75.2. That was for the first 13 games. In the last 10 games of the season, it went back up to 79.4, which was at that 2022 level. And the last 5 games, it went to 85.8, which was higher than the 2021 season. So we already started to see the shift in Richmond's game style throughout the season because, I mean, let's face it, no team goes into the season, especially a team as proud as Richmond is. You know, they won the premiership not too long ago, thinking they're going to suck as much as they did last year. Let's be brutal honest. Like, the teams are usually the last to figure out. Fantasy pundits, all these kind of people, they're sort of on top of it maybe a bit before the team is. So the start of the season, they went out trying to still play the way that they had done when they were winning premierships, but they just don't have the talent to do that anymore and it be successful. So over the course of the season, they start to adjust, and you see that come through in the marks. And not only did that happen for Richmond, it correlated with Jayden Short actually scoring better. So again, we break up those first 11 games, 81.4 average. I've taken out that injured score, by the way, 81.4. Last 10 games, he averages 86.4. Last 5 games, 90.4. And again, on 76% time on ground. So there's so much room for that time on ground to increase. And he's already putting up 90 plus points in those last 5 with the increase in marks. So I anticipate, and that's also without Daniel Rioli, Dustin Martin, and all these other guys leaving as well, and you're replacing them with kids. Yeah. So I think there's a very high untapped potential here. With a lot of these things changing, I think the floor is relatively safe. So I do believe that we're going to see Richmond, just because they have been the team that's not been a high uncontested possession team in the past. I don't think that should dissuade you from thinking that's a possibility this season, because it's a totally different team. It's a totally different position on the ladder. And like you said, they're just not going to want to get smashed every week. Yeah.
You want to look at some of those SuperCoach numbers that he alluded to there. It's a 96.6 in the last 5 weeks of the season. It's a 103 average. Again, using some of those game style changes that Mitch has so heavily alluded to us. And when I look at the people that you're buying in this range across SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy Dream Team, you're all looking for a little bit of value. We can talk about those top end premiums another day in that defensive line, but so often how we're trying to play these games now is, can I get some significant improvement output based on the cash outlay that I'm delivering? And there's 10 to 15 to 18 points per game of value of Jayden based on what you're paying for versus historically what he's been able to do for us. But Mitch, if we're looking for players in this sort of price range across the formats, most of them have an early buy that we're considering too. So we're going, oh, I like him, but he's going to miss round 4. I like him, he's going to miss round 3. That's not a concern for Jayden Short. And so as we start to look at reasons and variables for why not only is he relevant, but someone to pick, is he gives you an option that not too many in this price point give us.
Yeah, 100%. And not only that, like obviously a lot of the talk early on is that the defense is a hard line to pick. Like all the top guys are very difficult to see value in. So when you start to look at the cheaper guys, you go, okay, well, here's Callum Mills. He's got an early season buy. Here's Kadeem Coleman. He's got an early buy. Perryman, he's got an early buy. James Sicily, he's got an early buy. Tom Stewart, if he plays midfield, he's got an early buy. So there's a lot. It's very hard to pick these value guys without that early season buy, or you're paying top dollar for those guys who don't have the early buy, but you really don't see them improving and sometimes regressing in their role. So, like, I mean, if you just go down the list of those defenders, you've got players changing roles in Sheasel, Flanders, Nick Martin. You've got players who are 100 years old in Dane Zorko. You've got all these guys that have just got flags next to their names that I don't really feel comfortable paying up for. So I think it is these guys are leveled down. And if you can find a few that don't have the early season buy, well, then that I think is going to be the key to setting up a nice structure for your fantasy team. And I think Jayden Short ticks a lot of boxes in that regard.
I think you always want to look at not just the best possible outcome for a player, but also what's the worst case scenario here. And to me, the worst case scenario for Jayden Short is he is what he is right now. And that genuinely is the worst case scenario, is he's the 80 guy. And to get an 80 guy over the first 5 weeks of the season probably isn't going to be the difference between you getting into that top 1,000 contention early to really set up your season for success. If he only goes 80, that's not going to be the reason your season's going bad. That's just, he's doing what I paid for. Whereas opposed to you go into, again, picking a name, a Harry Sheasel type, and go, I'm paying at the top dollar of defenders, or a Luke Ryan, I'm paying at the top of my line, and they regress even just 5 to 8 points per game and back to maybe more their median rather than anything else. It's like, well, these are the selections that start to hurt you more rather than the guy that should do well, has a narrative for how he'll do well. And I just don't see a pathway who does worse than what he's priced at.
Yeah, and I think he's got an interesting first few rounds of fixtures as well, because you've got Carlton, who's the historical round one matchup, Port Adelaide, which is actually a fairly tough matchup for defenders, but then the very week next week you've got St Kilda, so you're going to get a very good idea of okay, well, what is Jayden Short going to be? You're going to have a lukewarm matchup against Carlton, you're going to have a tough matchup against Port Adelaide, you're going to have a matchup against St Kilda, all within the first 3 weeks. So by that point, you're going to have a very good idea of, okay, I've potentially seen his ceiling against St Kilda. I've potentially seen his floor against Port Adelaide. And it's still probably that last week before you really start to get into upgrade cadence in rounds 4 and 5 and 6, that it might be that week that you can still pivot off him. So if you don't like what you see against the Saints and it isn't the ceiling that you would hope for in a positive matchup like that, well, then it's a perfect time to parachute off and go to a different option. I think you're going to get a really good understanding of what Richmond are going to do, what Jayden Short's going to be doing within those first 3 weeks, and then you can sort of make your decision based on that. So I think that's an interesting way to look at your other options post the start of the season.
I think so. There's a world where, to me, I can see a 95-plus season where he's right on the edges of a top 10 to 15 across the formats averaging defender, which is insanely great value based on what you're paying, and he can become the last player you upgrade when you get to the mid-season buys. Or if you want to look at playing a 23rd, 24th premium in AFL Fantasy, or a 24th and 25th premium in SuperCoach, given you've got the flex, or in Dream Team is the same, he provides that avenue and option. He becomes the parachute early on if you're not happy with that outcome. He can become the movement. Maybe you're like, oh, Dan Rioli's nailed it in opening round and round 1, and I want a piece of that. Well, all of a sudden off the bye, you're not happy with Short. It becomes the parachute if Rioli does hold that market share and that scoring that we saw Flanders and Sexton, and even for a game or two last year, Will Powell. So even if things go bad, he's a trade that moves on. So there's so much to like about Jayden Short. To me, he feels like a pretty relevant player to me, Mitch, to talk about in 2025.
Yeah, well, I don't know if many people know this, but I have a reputation because last year I was on the show for one player. It was Lachie Whitfield, and I kept him all season. So, Jayden, you've got a bit of work to do. You're going to stay on my side all season to keep that record perfect. But no, seriously, I do think he's the kind of guy that I think if you're starting, you're hoping he's a guy that you can keep until the end of the bye rounds. I think there's a world where he's a 100+ averaging player. It's probably unlikely, but we have seen that in stretches for him in the past. I think there's room for him to surprise us and stay around a lot longer than we expect. But when you're paying 80 for a defender, if he can give you sort of 95, I think that's good enough. I'm not worried about him not being a top 6 defender. I think that's a little bit old school thinking. I think you just want a player to outperform their price, get close enough that they're not going to be super disappointing, and you want to trade them each week. So I agree with you. I think there's a lot of value there.
All right, let's talk about what he does on draft day before we wrap up this episode. Look, if it's based on averages, which historically the community often draft off previous seasonal averages from there, that would put him in at a D4 spot in SuperCoach and a D3 spot in AFL Fantasy. That's where his average would indicate he goes. But I know, Mitch, you've done some of your AFL Fantasy projections already. Where do you think his potential? We've just talked about him getting to the edges of 95 and 100 plus. That tells me you might be able to project he's going to go a little bit higher than based on that D3, D4 kind of average spot that his ranking suggests.
So what I like to do, what I like to do is I like to give, like I think you alluded to before, like a best case scenario and a worst case scenario, and give me like a bit of a range of outcomes. And sort of what do I think as I get closer to the season starting, I get more data, I'll narrow that in. But at the moment, I see his minimum range of average being 87, which was the same points per minute last year, but him just going up 3% time on ground. I think that's at a bare minimum. I see his top potential being about that 103 type average, just a little bit more than 100, which the median outcome basically means that he's about a 95 averaging player. And based on my projections, that would sit him sort of comfortably within the D2 type of range, with the potential for him being a D1. Now, I don't know if you're going to have to go that early to get him. So if you can snag him as a D3, I think that is his absolute floor. With the potential ceiling of him being a D2, maybe if everything goes right, he's a late D1 pick. So if you can get him in the third as your third defender, I think that's a steal personally.
Oh, if you could do that in AFL Fantasy, you'd be laughing. I'm similar. SuperCoach, I'd probably move everything back a position to say, look, his ceiling's probably a D2. The worst case scenario is you pick him as a D4 and you're getting an above return based on what his average is. So to me, he's a great guy to have. I don't see a world where, barring something drastically changing in the Richmond preseason, that I don't start a Jayden Short this year. Everything indicates to me that this is a really strong starting squad selection. And Mitch, if people have just caught up with you for the first time, maybe from the SuperCoach community, they're just getting to see and go, oh, I might give AFL Fantasy a trial. Where can people keep in touch with you and the Ball Boys gang? And what have you got planned for the upcoming preseason for us?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or X at Ball Boys Fantasy, and you can find our podcast, Ball Boys AFL Fantasy, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find that. We've just started our content. We released our first content last week on the 1st of January, so you can go check that one out. We are starting and doing currently our positional breakdown. So we're going through the defenders at the moment, and then we'll explore the midfielders, forwards, and rucks. We like to look at all the premium options, all the mid-price options, and we're also trying to do a little bit more draft content this year. So if you are someone who likes to play draft or want to get into it, my background is fantasy basketball, so draft is all we do in fantasy basketball. So it is something that I have a bit of experience in, but haven't applied it yet to fantasy footy, but wanted to get into that this season as well. So I'm looking forward to doing a bit of that with a lot of the extra platforms out there that we have to choose from this year. So it seems like a good time now more than ever.
It certainly does, mate. You're an absolute superstar. Love talking fantasy football with you. So Whitfield became the star. We've now established it as Jayden Short. Maybe we might need to get Mitch back on again during the 50 most relevant. Find another player that you can confidently lock in and just have them for the year, mate. You're a superstar. Thanks so much for jumping on the 50 most relevant.
I appreciate it, mate. Anytime.
If you want to check out this podcast or any of the others that have been revealed so far in the 50 most relevant, you can get the audio podcasts wherever you get your audio podcasts from. Make sure you give the channel a like, 5-star rating if you haven't already. And if you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. Let me know, what do you think Jayden's going to average in 2025? For all of those places that Mitch directed to you, for the podcast, for to get in touch with him and the team on social media, to check out the videos, we've got all those links for you in the description of this episode. So you can jump in there, click on those links and be able to check out some of the great stuff they are doing. As well, all the details to get in touch with the coaches panel. Find us across social media, get yourself access to our Patreon, pick up some coaches panel merch, whatever you need, everything's in the description of this episode. So, number 41 of the 50 most relevant is where we land tomorrow. Let me give you a clue about who it is. It's a player that last year had arguably one of his best years ever. He is an elite territory premium midfielder. And last year wasn't his only good year. He's had multiple really good years and been really relevant for us for a long, long time. But as I look across the community throughout social media when they do their team reveals, when I see others doing their content creation leaks of their team reveals, I haven't seen this guy anywhere. But he was an absolute star for us last year and has been so for many, many years. But why is nobody picking him? Have we all just gone crazy? Have we forgotten how good he is? Or are there some reasons for some concern in the community to not start this player? Who have I got at number 41? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.